everyone. Welcome to your episode 315 of the Percussion podcast. My name is Ben Charles, and with me, as always, are my lovely co-host Ksenija Komljenović.
Hey Ben, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. We're supposed to get some weather up here in North Texas this week, but hopefully down in South Texas, you're safe. Yeah,
Oh,
we got a
we're
snowstorm on Thursday, but
oh
I think
gosh.
you're fine.
Yeah.
Luckily, it shouldn't be nearly as bad as the one last year, so fingers crossed.
Yeah.
And Carli Viña.
Hey Ben, how's it going?
I'm doing well. How's the dog mom life?
We're going lots of walks. Yeah.
We were talking in our little podcast group chat earlier about work-life balance, and Carly was saying that having a dog is great because you go on walks 4 times a day. It's a nice responsibility to have, it sounds like.
Balance.
Well, and
So
it's something like it's so easy to be like, oh, I don't have time for that. But then
yeah,
you
now you
have
do.
to. You gotta find time for it.
Yeah, you either have time for a walk or time to clean the carpet, A or B. It's your choice. Well, if you're listening to this episode on its release date, it is February 10th. Carly, what happened in history on February 10th?
Yeah, February 10th is a good one, actually. On February 10th, 1878, it was the world premiere of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, so that's pretty cool. It was premiered at a Russian Musical Society concert in Moscow, and actually, initial critical reaction to this work was not so great, a little unfavorable. There was a reviewer from the New York Post who this is what they said. It's one of the most thoroughly Russian, i.e. semi-barbaric compositions ever heard in the city. If Tchaikovsky had called his symphony a sleigh ride through Siberia, no one would have found this title inappropriate.
Yikes.
Oh, so problematic.
So that's when I think actually this one's even funnier. There was a reviewer in Germany who wrote, "The composer's twaddle disturbed my mood. The confusion in brass and the abuse of the kettle drums drove me away." So I don't know. Anybody know what twaddle means?
Yes, and it's negative, but
Doesn't sound good. You can listen for the twaddle next time you hear Check 4.
Oh
Um,
dear.
but of course, Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony did eventually find its way into our beloved orchestral repertoire, despite these humorously negative reviews. So I thought I'd share with you a little bit of background on the symphony. Around the time that Tchaikovsky was writing the Fourth Symphony, there was a woman named Nadezhda von Meck, who was the wealthy widow of a Russian railroad magnate. And she started sending Tchaikovsky like a regular stipend that allowed him to stop teaching for the time being. And he started devoting himself full time to composition. And the Fourth Symphony is dedicated to her because her stipend is, I assume, part of what made it possible. After the premiere on February 10th, 1878 of the Fourth Symphony, she wrote to Tchaikovsky to ask if the symphony was programmatic, kind of what's the story behind this? And he responded by letter with the following. He said, "Usually when this question is put to me about a symphonic work, my answer is none." And then he goes on to say, "In our symphony, it is possible to express in words what it is trying to say, and to you, and only to you, ... And then he goes on in his letter to describe the meaning behind several of the passages throughout the symphony. So here's a little bit about the opening. The symphony opens with a strong motif in the horn that represents fate. Here's what Tchaikovsky said about the fate. "That fateful force which prevents the impulse to happiness from attaining its goals, which jealously ensures that peace and happiness shall not be complete and unclouded, which hangs above the head like the sword of Damocles, unwaveringly, constantly poisoning the soul. It is an invincible force that can never be overcome, merely endured hopelessly." So it's a little dark. I'll skip now to the fourth movement because partially that's the one that we tend to study and play and practice a whole lot. But if you want to read more about what Tchaikovsky said about all these different, the melodic themes, you can check out program notes that are on the Houston Symphony website. It's super interesting. So here's a little bit about the fourth movement. The finale begins with a fortissimo rush of notes at breakneck speed. These musical fireworks conjure images of a public festival. Tchaikovsky says, "If within yourself you find no reasons for joy, then look at others. Picture the festive merriment of ordinary people." This wild celebratory music alternates with a Russian folk song, which is called In the Field a Birch Tree Stood, in which a married woman sings to her lover. And this revelry continues until the fate motif of the first movement makes a dramatic reappearance. Tchaikovsky says, "Hardly have you managed to forget yourself and to be carried away by the spectacle of the joys of others, then irrepressible fate appears again and reminds you of yourself." Gradually, the festive music returns, and of this, Tchaikovsky says, "But others do not care about you, and they have not noticed that you are solitary and sad. Oh, how they are enjoying themselves, how happy they are that all their feelings are simple and straightforward. Reproach yourself and do not say that everything in this world is sad. Joy is a simple but powerful force. Rejoice in the rejoicing of others. To live is still possible." So later, this is what he wrote to basically his patroness. Later to his student, who is also a composer, Sergei Taneyev, Tchaikovsky reportedly wrote, "Of course, my Fourth Symphony has a program, but of a kind impossible to formulate in words. Was it not the purpose of the symphony as a musical form to express that for which there are no words, but which surges from the soul and demands expression?" So later he kind of, was publicly walking it back and not really expressing that there was a program for this. There have been a lot of historians and biographers of Tchaikovsky who have projected that the theme of fate in his Fourth Symphony actually relates to his struggle to accept his homosexuality. But then there are others who say that the Fourth Symphony was just born out of this depression that he was in during that time in his life, and not necessarily related to his sexuality. Regardless, it is a hugely expressive and effective work of art. So go take a listen to Czech 4 today if you are interested.
That was so
Awesome.
semi-barbaric. That was horrible. All these things that he talked about, existential crises and not trying to be a solipsist and the sword of Damocles, that's so barbaric. It's so uneducated. That was great. Thank you. We need to find out who that reviewer was, though.
Right.
Very
Knock
well
on their
done,
door.
Carly. And for anyone curious, I looked up twaddle. The definition is trivial or foolish speech or writing nonsense. So yeah, actually, Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony was the first symphony I ever performed on timpani in an orchestra, which is not an easy start. The first movement is pretty tricky, but I love this piece. The last movement's one of my favorite finales of a symphony. And if anyone's unfamiliar, the third movement, the scherzo, is called Pizzicato ostinato. And I think it's the whole movement, or at least the majority of the movement. The strings are all pizzicato, and a lot of the time the violins will hold their violin in guitar position, which is kind of cute.
And just a question, did you abuse the kettle drums?
I hope not, but it's entirely possible that I did. Well, thank you so much, Carly. Let's get on to introducing our guest for the day. Our guest today is David Harvey. David is a marimbist, educator, and percussion historian. He has interviewed many mallet percussionists from the early 20th century, beginning in the 1970s, and has an extensive collection of memorabilia about mallet percussion history, including instruments, recordings, scores, press releases, and letters. So welcome, David Harvey.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So David, I thought we would start out by just talking about, and I think maybe this is an obvious question or an obviously answered question, but why do you think that it's valuable for students to study percussion history?
Well, the thing is, music has a history, and to understand the music that you're playing, understanding the history puts the music in context. So, learning music history is a big thing. Learning musical style and performance is a big thing. There's a lot to learn, right? It's not just showing up and making noise on an instrument. You need to make music. And so you have to learn how to play your instrument, right? Without proficiency on an instrument, how are you going to make music, or your voice, whatever? There's always technique involved. But then at some point, it's time to stop playing an instrument or using your voice and make music. Right. And so, just like the background that Karli shared about Czech 4, it's like, wow, that kind of, Czech 4 to us today is old stuff, right? It's sentimental, it's romantic, it's a warhorse in the symphonic repertoire. We've all probably heard it in our profession over and over, like since childhood. But to hear that review, to hear that analysis that was contemporary, that puts that in perspective. That was a revolutionary sound when it was premiered, right? So Busoni, the lead Italian pianist, was saying that music gets played for centuries and it builds up the dust of something like the dust of tradition and the dust of typical practices, and he thinks that the idea of performing is to go back to the source, back to when it was written, and music that was revolutionary when it was premiered should sound revolutionary today in the way that you approach it. Now, that's a little hard to define, like, well, what does that really mean? But to get back to the question you were asking about, what's the value of music history? It puts music in perspective, and so I'll give you like just a random example that's not really mallet percussion, but it can be. People play Bach string music on marimba, right? Okay, and one of the movements that you hear, time to time, kind of regularly, is the presto in G minor from the violin sonata in G minor. And when Bach wrote that, late Baroque era, the term presto did not mean what it became to mean in the later eras of the 19th century, which meant very rapidly, essentially as rapidly as you want to play. In Bach's time, presto did not mean that. So it basically meant perpetual motion, moto perpetuo. They didn't have the term in Bach's time, moto perpetuo, but they used the term presto to mean that. So if you see the term presto in a Bach score, it's typically in a movement like the presto in G minor, 1006, where 1001, where it's all 16th notes. So he's telling you, as the composer, with the one simple word presto, do not play rubato in this movement. That's what he's telling you. Do not play. But now in 2022, what do we hear? We hear people playing that as though the term presto in that score means what it meant 150 years later, which is play it as fast as you want. And so, that's an idea of music history matters when you want to make music. If you want to play marimba, and if you want to use that piece to show off, great. I mean, that's one thing you can do with the marimba. But if you want to play Bach and you want to use that movement, you have to have some context to play it. Now, I know this is a run-on answer. My last thing I want to say is the other thing you might want to do with that piece is do a harmonic analysis, because that is strictly a melody with no harmonies written down. But if you learn the harmonies by analyzing the harmonic content, then you're going to understand the phrasing and certain phrases and certain cadences and certain dissonant harmonies. So, studying the history and the style of the music always matters, right? So.
Yeah, I was actually thinking today about, at the University of Miami, Ross Harbaugh, who was the cello professor, taught once every few semesters a seminar on Bach cello suites. And I took that class, and yeah, like harmonic analysis was a big piece of that class. So
correct.
Wonderful.
Correct.
Well, in terms of percussion history, percussion is like revered as like the oldest instrument, cavemen beating on rocks and things. But it seems like pianists and violinists especially have volumes and volumes of books about their instrument's history. And as percussionists, we have very little. The ones that I can think of that come to mind are the James Blades Percussion Instruments in Their History book, which Norm Weinberg, with his VAP or VAP Media, I don't know which is the correct pronunciation, has made that available digitally. The Rebecca Kite book, which I think is also available through Norm Weinberg's company. David, your percussion history course, the Center for Mallet Percussion Research, a few dissertations, and then after that it sort of falls off. And if we're keeping track of that list, that's only 2 actual long-form books. So, David, what are some resources that you think people should be aware of if they're interested in studying percussion history?
Yeah, so all those that you mentioned are excellent. I think that the Center for Mallet Percussion Research in Kutztown, at Kutztown University, they're still getting up to speed there. They're having a very exciting project going on right now, which is a building is in construction now, will be available sometime in 2022. That will be devoted exclusively to the Center for Mallet Percussion Research. So this is the first time I'm aware of in history that a facility has been specifically designed, engineered, and built for percussion history and for percussion research. So that's very exciting. So that means that percussion history is becoming institutionalized at the academic level, right? So I think that because that hasn't happened yet, the building is not there, The Center for Mallet Percussion Research isn't really up and running at 100% capacity. They're doing great things. They've been around since, I think, 2015. And they've done some great things, and they're going to continue to do great things. But that's going to become, I think, that research center in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, is going to become a global focus as far as a resource, as far as programs that they're going to offer, live events, research, the digitizing all the information there so that it can be an online global resource. So we're coming into like a new era almost with that. Beyond that, there are other online resources for recordings. For instance, my thing is marimba and xylophone. That's what I play. I play marimba, and I do marimba and xylophone history, education. So in that regard, there's a couple of tremendous websites for vintage recordings from pre-World War II, which is really amazing that those recordings exist. They've been digitized. Just with a click of a button, you can listen to them. One is the Discography of American Historical Recordings. It's just a website, and they specialize in disc recordings from pre-World War II. And you could literally, if you go to DAHR, Discography of American Historical Recordings, DAHR.com, I believe, then you can listen to literally hundreds of recordings of the xylophone and marimba from pre-World War II. It's amazing. Another very similar site is the University of California at Santa Barbara, which has a similar discographical site, which technically it's for cylinder recordings, which is a different type of recording that predated discs. Before they even invented a flat round disc for a phonograph record, they had cylindrical phonograph records. Well, this University of California at Santa Barbara has an extensive collection of thousands and thousands of cylinder recordings, which date from the 1890s to the 1920s. And that site includes probably a couple hundred recordings of the xylophone. So you can literally, with just 2 websites, have more recordings than you ever want to hear from that era of mallet percussion. So that's important. And then beyond the Center for Mallet Percussion Research, beyond books, beyond recordings and so forth, there's networking, right? So we have Facebook groups. So I have my own group which on Facebook, which is Marimba and Xylophone History. So there's that. We have more than 5,000 members worldwide. There are other Facebook groups like Vintage Mallet Instruments. Danielle Squires has a wonderful group, Orchestral Percussion Talk, right? And that gets into a lot of times they talk about history. When they're talking with someone's playing a particular piece in an orchestra, they'll go into the history of the New York Phil did it this way, and and Saul and Arnie, and they did it this way. So they're very good with history over there, even though it's not specifically a history group. So networking using the internet. But I have to say that's like the concrete answer to your question. What are the resources? And I'm gonna kind of addend your question a little bit to say, beyond the resources, what do you do with the resources as a student, right? When I was learning to play marimba in the, should I say it, the 1970s, okay. In the 1970s, there were no resources for the marimba. And one thing I did was I started finding old recordings of George Hamilton Green, okay? And even though I played marimba, not xylophone at the time, there were these recordings of music on the keyboard that I like to play and learn and so forth. And I actually would transcribe some of those recordings because I didn't have the sheet music for them. So I would take like a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and I would record the phonograph record onto the reel-to-reel tape, because on the reel tape it had multiple speed settings. And then I would slow it down, and I would write out that transcription, and I would learn it. And I got to be that. Like, I would learn that music so thoroughly that if George Hamilton Green played a roll on a certain note in that piece, I literally knew how many strokes were in that roll on that particular half note or on that particular dotted eighth note. And I would play back that recording by myself, literally with the same number of strokes in the tremolo or the roll, to get that certain open. He had kind of an open, loose style of rolling that sounded really good on the Rosa. Anyway, the point being, it's what you do with the material. You have to study it, and you have to assimilate it, and you have to take all these historical situations that happened, and if you study them, then there's that expression that we use, connecting the dots. Eventually you have to have a picture. So you see this little snapshot, this little sliver over here that happened in this decade and this performer. And then eventually there's enough dots that you can connect them and you have now a view of history. And recently, you mentioned Rebecca Kite's wonderful book, on Keko and the history of the 5-octave marimba and the development of the 5-octave marimba. And one of the things when I reviewed that book online was I said that not only was that book copiously researched, but it was very clear from the dialogue, from the contents, the way Rebecca presented that material, that Rebecca had connected the dots in her own mind, that she had become an expert, that she had a very cognizant and clear view of that history. So she was able to present it well. So that's my point. I have a Facebook friend who belongs to my Facebook group, and he was asking me online, do you have this recording by George Green? And I'm looking for this other recording by George. Yeah, sure, no problem. Here you go. Here's an MP3. And I said to him in chat, I said, I actually transcribe those. If you want, I can just send you PDFs, And he said to me, no, please don't send me the PDFs. I want to transcribe it myself because I'll learn it better. I was like, wow, great answer, like great attitude. And there's no doubt that he's going to learn it. Like he said, he's going to learn it well. He would rather immerse himself in it. So that's my little, so I think I answered your question, but I also addended it to another, like part 1A. So I do think it's important that you study it. And if you're playing an instrument, I get it. Like playing an instrument, just playing the instrument's a full-time gig. Just practicing and learning and developing and the gear and the gigs and the teachers and the schedule and, paying the bills and walking the dog, right? And so it's a lot. But, you have to have a context, getting back to the beginning of the conversation today with me, you have to have a context for that. So study, the resources are there. This is 2022, the world of, this is the global information age. There's no excuse to not have access to information or data. It's what you do with it, so.
That's so beautifully said and so encouraging to hear that there's a human being out there who is given the opportunity to take a shortcut and they said, no, thank you. I'd rather take the road myself and figure it out. It's amazing. Yeah.
Right. So that tells me that person is going to have that ethic about his life. He's going to have that approach to managing his life, right? So that's good.
Exactly. That is great. So as someone who so obviously loves the art form and is so dedicated to sort of remembering and documenting every element of it in history, what about your personal history? Do you remember the first time that you saw a 5-octave marimba?
Yeah, I do. And it was funny because it was Nancy Zelsman, and this was in the early 1980s. I want to say 1983, but it might have been, no, it was not, it was like later, it might have been 1988. But anyway, but it was around that time, a little fuzzy on the exact date. And she was doing a recital in Cambridge, and we had gone to school together, Nancy and I, at New England Conservatory of Music in Boston. And she had a 4 1/3 octave Musser M250, pretty standard for our generation at that time, that she had a bass extension added to. And so that was a 5-octave instrument by, it was like a Franken instrument, right? It's like, so it was but it was the first 5-octave keyboard. I mean, I had seen Keko play a performance in Carnegie Hall in New York in the 80s, and she was still playing a 4.5 octave instrument at that time. She wasn't using the 5-octave. So the very first 5-octave was Nancy Zelsman's, which wasn't even designed as a 5-octave instrument. So it was even later than that, and the Yamaha was the first one I saw. So when and put out the 5-octave, that was the first one I saw. It's like, wow, you don't have to have an extension anymore. Like, so again, I think I'm dating myself quite a bit today. So it's just going to be that way, I guess. It is what it is, right? So
I was going to say there are pictures of Keko with that extension that you're describing. Yeah, it's like a roll-up little thing they stuck at the bottom of the instrument, and it seems so foreign to us today. Like, why don't you just build it? But that's how they did it.
Yeah. Well, there was a thing, and to answer that question, why didn't they just go with 5 octaves? I got to tell you, I think the thing that was the issue there is that lower bass notes on the marimba have resonators that are too long to be straight, because then the keyboard would be up at your head level, right? So I think the problem and why that never really became common until when it did, manufacturing issue. How do you bend pipes? How do you bend metal pipes? And so I think that's what held it up as long as it did.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's so cool to think about. I mean, to be reminded that what we play, what we know is standard now is not that old.
Right, exactly. And I have to remember that today too when I interact with people on Facebook. I literally, there's not a day that goes by that I don't get contact from people all over the world about the subject, believe it or not. I mean, no one's more surprised than me. When I decided to make a Facebook group, I was already into at that time, there was still CDs were viable. Like now it's all playlists, but like I produced CDs and stuff like that. And I was just starting to think, I really need to share this. I'm getting a little older. And I've got quite a bit of information now, and I really need to share it with the next generation. That was all I was thinking. Like, I just got to get it. And I thought, although I was convinced, like, nobody will be interested in it, but I still have an obligation, So I'll make a Facebook group, and maybe I'll get maybe 50 people who, might also be interested in this very niche topic. And no, it's like there's a generation out there. A couple generations behind me that just don't have that background work taught it in a systemic way, in an organized way, and so they're very interested in learning. And it's kind of surprising, but it's a good thing, right? So.
Well, I want to say congratulations on the Facebook group, because I think it's, amazing. And so I learned so much from your group and from the other groups that you mentioned too. I think when those were first starting to crop up, I don't know, 8-10 years ago, I was kind of like, Facebook, like, what am I going to learn for, Facebook's for fun and whatever. But I mean, I refer students to stuff I find in those groups all the time. It's just so valuable.
Right. And one thing I when people join the group, I give them a welcome message where I suggest to them that they use the search function, because the group's been online now for 5 years or more, probably more than that. And there's at this point, there's a wealth of posts. Everybody's been posting for years now. So you drop in a topic into the search function, and there's a lot of information there. If you just wait for the feed to come, that's fine. You can do that. But you can also use it as a resource tool by searching. So there's a lot there.
I was just going to add a couple things. We had briefly mentioned the Center for Mallet Percussion Research, and episode 310, 5 episodes ago, we had Frank Kumor, who's the sort of head of that project. So if anyone's interested in that, that's a good episode to check out. And also to Ksenija's question of when's the first time you saw a 5-octave marimba, it's always funny to me that we think of the 5-octave marimba as give or take 1980. Keiko Abe helped Yamaha develop it, and then other companies followed suit shortly after. But actually, way back when, if you are watching on YouTube, you can see this. There were very large instruments, and this instrument here is a marimba xylophone or xylophone marimba. I can't remember what marketing name they used for it, but this is in the Sousa archives at the University of Illinois, and it looks like it was actually restored in 2015 by Century Mallet in Chicago. But it's a 5-octave, it's F to F instrument. So the modern 5-octave instrument it debuted around 1980, but there were extended range instruments available many, many years ago. So, but moving forward, David, beginning in the 1970s, you interviewed many early 20th century mallet percussionists, including some of those involved in the Musser marimba orchestras. What inspired you to take this step way back when? And were there any favorite stories, be they informational or just amusing, that you uncovered?
Oh, yeah. So why did I do that? Originally I was collecting, in the very first year I started playing the marimba, I also started researching the history of it. And it was because I was trying to get sheet music to play on the marimba that was written for the instrument. And a lot of that was xylophone music from pre-World War II, but there was also Musser marimba music and other music for the marimba. And so I was trying to get that music, and none of it had been republished at that point, reprinted, So in order to find that music, I had to go to older people. I was a teenager at the time. I had to go to older percussionists and say, do you have any old marimba or xylophone music? And usually these percussionists were orchestral people, guys or gals who had orchestra gigs, because at that time there was no marimba majors in school, and the marimba scene hadn't blown up into what it is today. Nobody just played marimba at that. Nobody. Like Nancy Zelsman and I might have been it, you know, as far as people that just wanted to play the marimba. So that was the start of me socially networking in the 70s, was to find sheet music to play on the instrument. And that meant a lot of the people that had that music were people who were either older than me, or even people who had played the music prior to World War II. And I would always ask, you know, who else do you know? Is there anyone out? Do you have a phone number? Because at that time there was no cell phones, no internet. You know, boy, I really sound like a grandfather right now. I'm not a grandfather, but I think I sound like one today for some reason. But you asked about my youth, so that's how it started. And then I had a couple like kind of lucky breaks where a couple of the people that I contacted had lists of people, names and phone numbers and addresses, and they gave me like, I'll give it this guy. You should definitely call Hal Trummer over at Deegan, because he was the sales manager for 40 years and he can tell you a lot of people. And then another fellow was this elderly gentleman at the time, Bradley Spinney, who was a 1930s New York gigging guy on xylophone and drums. And he gave me, you should call Sammy Herman. Here's his phone number. And then you should call this guy, Salve Gavicchio. You know, so I just kind of was looking for sheet music, and then I just started networking. And in a little bit of a broader sense, you know, when I started playing the marimba, the very first day, literally, I'm not making the very first day I played the marimba, I said, that's it. That's what I'm doing with my life. I was a teenager, and I came from a musical family. I have another sister who's a professional musician, lifelong professional pianist, conductor, arranger. And my parents were both musicians. And so I played piano when I was very young. I played drums when I was very young. And then when I had my first marimba lesson, I knew the keyboard because it was the same keyboard layout as a piano. And I knew the hammering action because I had been doing drums before that. So the very first time I played the marimba, I actually was able to read music and play something on it, you know, with my teacher. I had a teacher. And so I was like, that's it, I'm doing it. And then I was like, you know, a happy kid who just found something he loved, right? Like it was nothing special. It's just like, that's what happens, right? And if you're lucky, you find something you love to do. And so I would hang around with other musicians, and then people would say to me, oh, you're a musician. It could be an adult talking to me, could be a pianist or a drummer talking to me. And they'd say, what do you play? I say, I play the marimba. And I'd be all excited about it. And they would just get this look on their face, like as if I had just said something in Latin, you know? And then the question would come, what's a marimba? I'm like, well, it's like a big xylophone. And then the same look, like I had just said something in Greek. And I would say, xylophone, that's a big keyboard with wooden notes, and you hit it with, oh, yeah. So, I'll be honest, I didn't like that. It's like, oh, if somebody said, what do you play? Oh, I play the piano. Oh, great. They would never say, get a weird face and say, did you say piano? How do you say that? What's a piano, you know? And so it made me feel like the thing that I love to do didn't matter as much as all the other musicians I knew. And I hung around, you know, hundreds. That's all I did. I hung around with musicians. I was into music, right? And it made me feel like my marimba thing didn't matter as much as all of their things. And I didn't like that. So I just wanted to learn everything I could about it and see if there was, you know, I was already collecting music just to play. I was already kind of networking with other people, most of whom were older, and a lot of them from an older generation, just to find music. And then I said, you know what? I want to kind of prove to myself or learn, you know, my instrument must matter too. It must have a history. And so I got to tell you, like today in 2022, it's astounding the history that the marimba and xylophone have. And the only difference, I think, in the viability, okay, of that history is that the marimba was documented later, like 100 years later, than the violin or the piano. Okay, when I was a student, because I'm just a curious guy in general, right? I read all these biographies of Chrysler on the violin, Rubinstein on the piano, Busoni on the piano, biographies about Bach, Bach's own theoretical writings, right? I just wanted to learn all of that stuff, right? So that stuff was written, you know, 100 years ago. There was a complete history of the violin and the great tradition of the great pianist, you know? And because the mallet instruments came 100, 150 years later, I'm just doing that work now today, okay? And other people before me have done. I didn't start it. There are people who have been doing like doctoral theses on the marimba and Musser's groups, 25 years ago. And I have books by Frank McCallum and other people, the Book of the Marimba. So it's not like I'm like the first person to do it. I'm not saying that at all. There've been a lot of dedicated people who have done that, but it hasn't reached a point where it's about to reach, or it's kind of currently coming to, where people documented the histories of the violin and the piano 100 years ago. So hopefully, I don't know if I'll see it, but 50 years from now, when someone says I play the marimba, there won't be that look of the other person saying, right? So, so that's the long and short of it. I do have like, a lot of stories. I won't get into them because we have a limit here. I'll just tell you one. Again, I was a teenager. I was in my first maybe 2 or 3 years of playing the marimba, and my father took our car to get like an oil change or something. And his mechanic, he'd been going to for years. And this guy who was the mechanic, his name, the mechanic, not my father, the mechanic was George Dodlin. And you're going to have to remember that name. That's why I'm telling this story, George Dodlin. So this guy, George Dodlin, at that time in the 70s was elderly. He could have been retired by that point, but I think he just kept the garage going to have something to do every day. He wasn't particularly active with it. And my father and him were kind of buddies. Like, my father would go get coffees, and my father would go for an oil change and come back 3 hours later. That's what I'm saying, right? So this guy, George Dodlin, knew my family, didn't really know us, but like through my father, he knew. So one day my father's there and he said, I wasn't there, but George Dodlin says to my father, oh, how's your son doing? And my father was like, oh, he plays the marimba now. Like, that's all he wants to do all day long. The marimba, So George Dodlin says to my dad, he goes, oh, when I was a kid, I played the xylophone, and I still have a method book. So, tell your son, tell David if he wants this book, he can have it. I think I still got it, So my father comes home, he's like, hey, I was talking to George Dodlin. He has a xylophone book. You want it? I goes, yeah, sure. Great. I'm all about that, I already had a little bit of a collection of sheet music. And so like, I don't know, sometime later, my father went back and he comes home with George Hamilton Green's elementary instructor for the xylophone. All right, nice. So I get this book and George Hamilton Green. I knew who that guy was, right? So this is pretty cool. And I look through the pages and you can see the dates from the 1930s when George Dodlin, remember that name, George Dodlin, was taking his lessons and his teacher was writing in the dates, it was like June 7th, 1936, or whatever. Okay, great. So that's a nice little story. But I told you that story so that I can tell you another one. So remember the name, George Dodlin. So now 20 years later, I contacted a member of George Hamilton Green's family. I actually contacted, like, believe it or not, like every surviving member of George Hamilton Green's extended family, like many people in that family. And one of those persons said to me, I have let's just say George Hamilton Green's sheet music. I have quite a bit of his sheet music. Would you like to come visit me and see this music? Was that a trick question? Like, yeah, give me the address. I'm there, right? So I go visit this person, and this person says to me, "Would you like to see, his music?" Yeah. So this relative takes out a stack, like a stack of sheet music that was George Hamilton Green's personal copies of all his music. All the ragtime music that he wrote, all the classical music that he wrote, Vals Brillante, the Caprice, all the pop music that had been published by Carl Fischer and so forth, that had not been sold, was in mint condition, mint condition, not a wrinkle, not a tear, not a pencil mark, nothing, right? So I'm like a kid on Christmas morning, whatever, a kid in a candy store, great, Christmas on a cracker. This is, so I'm very reverently, I don't want to like accidentally turn a page too fast and tear it or something. I'm like, this is like the Holy Grail, right? So I go through one piece, page by page. I go to the next piece. Kind of slowly enjoying it, And every time I go through a piece of this music, I turn it over face down because I'm so reverent. I don't want to get the order of the stack like out of order. I want to be polite to my host, right? And so I figure when I'm all done, I'll just flip the stack over. I was a good, steward of this, right? So I'm halfway through or whatever. I don't know. I'm going through the stack. And as I turn one over, I'm done with it now. I turn one over, and the only mark in that entire stack, the only pencil mark in that entire stack on the back of that piece of music, it says, what does it say? Dodlin, and there's a phone number that I recognize as a Lowell, Massachusetts phone number, because I recognize the exchange, right? And I'm like, whoa, like mind's blown. Like the only, literally, I'm not, like the only mark on that entire stack of music was the name Dodlin and a Lowell phone number. So obviously, like, well, not obvious, but I'll explain it. Like George Hamilton Green in the 1930s had a teaching studio in New York City. He had like just tons and tons of students, and he also self-published music. And so this guy, George Dodlin in Lowell in the 1930s, was taking lessons, and his teacher told him, get this elementary method book by George Hamilton Green. And so one day, I'm guessing, right, like George Dodlin called George Hamilton Green, hey, you know, my teacher said I need to get this book, and can I buy it? You know, how much does it cost? And George Hamilton Green was busy. He said, hold on, what's your name? Oh, George Dodlin. And George Dodlin, George Green, maybe he didn't need to write the word George because it's his first name. He just wrote down Dodlin. Let me see if I have that in stock. I'll call you back, you know? So like, wow. And that was that doesn't happen every day, right? So
Well, it's funny your story about wanting, like, you know, why don't people know what a marimba is? That's, I think, a battle that many of us still fight today. But if you've ever seen any marketing materials for Malatech, Lee Howard Stevens is rightfully not afraid to proclaim that he was hailed as the world's greatest classical marimbist by Time magazine. And if you go, you can Google and find the article from 1988. And the article, it is positive. It's about Lee Howard Stevens and portrays him in a positive light, but it's maybe not the most reverent article that it sounds like it would be. And I'd like to just read the first paragraph of the article. It says, first of all, the marimba is not a dance like the mambo, nor is it a folk band like a mariachi, nor should it be confused with maracas, those hollow gourds filled with dry seeds that shake, rattle, and roll south of the border. Most audiences could not pick it out of a percussion lineup, and concert managers flee at the very mention of its name. For Lee Howard Stevens, to be the world's greatest classical marimbist must sometimes seem a dubious achievement. Which, yeah, it's kind of like Karli's article on the Tchaikovsky. It's like, it is a compliment technically, but it's maybe not the compliment that it sounds like.
It's a backhanded one.
But you know, Lee did a PASIC recital when PASIC was in New York City in 1979, and that recital was at Town Hall in New York. And I went there with a lot of people, you know, in the Northeast, went to that performance. Nice recital. And I remember in the reception line afterwards, Lee making a maraca joke, actually. You know, he was talking to like I think it was like somebody who knew brought somebody who he didn't know, who didn't know what the marimba was. And I think Lee says something, he did this motion, the maraca, he goes, oh, he's talking to that person who doesn't know the marimba. He goes, I bet you thought you were being dragged into like one of these, like, it was going to be like this, you know, like maraca. Like Lee has like obviously like a wry sense of humor if you know him. I don't know him personally real well, but I mean we met a few times. But yeah, he's got a wry sense of humor, no doubt about it. but yeah, good point though, right? I mean, but things are a little better now, better than 1988.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, David, we've been talking a lot about the Green Brothers, and I think most students are familiar with the Green Brothers, and I can't name how many times someone's seen a video of Teddy Brown pop up on some Facebook page and send it my way. So I think most people are familiar with the Green Brothers and Teddy Brown, and then there's, of course, the modern virtuosos like Bob Becker and Jonathan Singer that everyone's familiar with. But who are some of the lesser-known ragtime xylophonists that should enter our vocabulary, and maybe what's one or two things notable about each of them?
Yeah, so here's the thing. So there were like in the United States, literally hundreds or thousands of people who were playing the xylophone. Some of them were drummers who doubled on xylophone. Some of them just specialized on xylophone. And then when the marimba became viable in the 1920s and 30s, you know, people started doubling on the marimba. So to say, you know, ragtime xylophonist, there were, you know, hundreds of musicians who played ragtime on the xylophone. And certainly not as popular as the Green Brothers, George Hamilton Green and Joe Green, but there was El Coda, which may have been a pseudonym for Lawrence Coates or Edward L. Coates. El Coda was someone who performed in vaudeville and played ragtime on the xylophone. Chris Chapman performed ragtime on the xylophone and recorded it. And Jess Libanati was a vaudevillian who played only the xylophone. He was not a drummer. And he was actually billed as the ragtime xylophonist. So that's Jess Libanati. So those are some Americans. And then the other thing is today as percussionists, we kind of use the term ragtime to refer to all of the pre-World War II rhythmic xylophone music. And in fact, there's also quite a bit of swing jazz that went on. So like Harry Brewer's compositions for the xylophone from the 1930s, like Back Talk and so forth. Red Norvo's compositions for the xylophone from the 1930s. That was more like swing jazz. So Harry Brewer and Red Norvo weren't really ragtime xylophonists, even though when they were students, they played ragtime on the xylophone. They would play George Hamilton Green's ragtime on the xylophone as students, but the music they played professionally and they wrote was more swing jazz. And we might think of that today as part of the ragtime xylophone thing. And it's, you know, closely linked, it's related. So Harry Brewer, Sammy Herman, Red Norvo, and then one guy that we don't know too much about today was very musical and influential. It was Rudy Starita, who was an Italian born in Italy who immigrated as a child to the United States. And then he ended up moving in the 1920s to England and had his career in England. So Rudy Starita, who was active in England. You mentioned Teddy Brown. And you know, I could go on, you know, there's literally too many, like we could be here till sunrise tomorrow. There's a lot of names. There's a lot of names. And as a matter of fact, vapmedia.com, which is my publisher, has a series of playlists. I think we're up to 7 at this point. And one of those playlists is called Ragtime Xylophone. And that playlist has, I believe, 22 ragtime xylophone recordings from pre-World War II, each by a different xylophonist. So that playlist alone, I'm not trying to market myself, but like that playlist alone has 22 different xylophonists, all recorded from the pre-World War II era, all ragtime music. So there's a lot there.
I was going to mention also, it seems like after the sort of early 20th century ragtime craze in the mid 20th century, there were actually a lot of very prominent female marimba artists. Vida Chenoweth, of course, comes to mind, and also Ruth Stuber, who premiered the Creston Marimba Concertino, as well as Vera Dalen, who I just know the name. I don't really know anything about her.
Yep. Yeah. Well, you know, I want to say when I used to do my presentation, Marimba and Xylophone History Live, which, you know, COVID killed that. So, but it's online now, which is good. But when I used to do it live, when I would get to the 1940s marimba scene in that presentation, I would actually I would label it this way, but I would always say, this is the point where women saved the day for the marimba, you know, because really that first modern generation of marimbas who were students of Claire Musser were a lot. I want to say they were all women, because there was Burton and Jackson. There were men as well, but I want to say that, you know, being raised in the United States, being aware of the fact that women have never had the same privilege as men, they've had to fight for that every step of the way, and it kind of is like a badge of honor to me that the marimba in the 1940s was a vehicle where women. I don't want to say it's fair to them to say they had equal rights, because they were still struggling, obviously, right? They're still struggling today in some regards. We're still waiting for the first American female president, right? But I'm proud that these women had a professional vocational avenue via the marimba in the 1940s, when it was not common for women to have any professional vocational avenue. So Vida Chenoweth, Vera Dalen, Ruth Jean Stuber, there's like at least 8 to 10 students of Musser's who were all women and did great things. Like there was one group that was all female that was at Northwestern University in the 1940s under the direction of Claire Musser. He didn't perform with it, called the Marimba Coeds, and it had to be called Coeds to justify the fact that females were, you know, in this organization. And they actually were incredibly professionally talented, sophisticated, polished chamber music group. It was basically a marimba quartet. So I actually have videos of them performing, and the United States government actually sponsored them to do a world tour, and they literally toured 25,000 miles in 1 year. Not 2,500 miles. I didn't misspeak. 25,000 miles. They took the marimba.
Why haven't I heard of this? That's fascinating. That's amazing.
Right. Yeah, because it only happened in mid 20th century, and we're just now at this point getting to the making this stuff available globally, this information.
Changing pace a bit here, we often think of ragtime xylophone history as an American tradition, and we've certainly discussed that quite a bit. I think that many people are surprised to hear that the xylophone also has a rich history in Japan, and a friend of mine, Akiko Goto, has written a wonderful dissertation on the artistic life of Japanese xylophone virtuoso Yoichi Hiraoka, for whom the Mayazumi Xylophone Concerto was written. Can you tell us some of this history of this instrument, some of this instrument's history in Japan? Like, first of all, how did it get there? How did it develop? How has it affected modern playing?
Okay, sure. So what happened in Japan is that the xylophone showed up in Japan commercially, meaning that companies were selling commercial instruments made by Deegan in America, or Japanese companies started manufacturing them in a commercial way. So I say commercially manufactured instruments around 1920 or so. In Japan, initially there was two xylophonists, one you mentioned, Ben Yoichi Hiraoka, and also Aichi Asabuki. And those guys were born in 1907 and 1909 respectively. And around 1920, both of those guys, they didn't know each other personally, but they both just went to a department store and bought manufactured xylophones and began playing them. And then in 1929, Hiraoka decided he wanted to come to the United States and make a career in the United States. And so in order to raise money for the trip to the United States, which happened in 1930, in 1929, he started releasing recordings. He went to work in commercial phonograph recording studios, making xylophone music on records to be sold. And that gave him money for his immigration trip to the United States. And so those recordings started being shared over there. And also, prior to Hiraoka recording on the xylophone in Japan, it was common practice for phonograph records, which in the 19-teens were the dominant form of music entertainment worldwide, okay? American phonograph record companies would license their recordings all over the globe. So in my collection, I have many recordings that were manufactured or produced or recorded in the United States around World War I, 1920s and 30s, a little later. And then I also have those same pressings on different record companies from England and Europe and Japan. I have a recording from 1926 of George Hamilton Green that was released on the Columbia Phonograph Record Company in the United States, and then licensed to Japan. And I have the Japanese pressing from a few years later in the 20s. So I know for a fact that recordings by the American xylophonist William Wrights and George Hamilton Green were heard by Hiraoka and Asabuki at that time, okay? So the Americans had their influence with the recordings, and also just the fact that Japan was manufacturing xylophones at all was due to two things. Japan was just always very sophisticated with manufacturing, very, very advanced society over there. And they had a tendency pre-World War II to emulate and copy the United States. So when Deegan was making xylophones and Leedy was making xylophones, they noticed those things. And they were very good at manufacturing. So then eventually they're manufacturing their own instruments too. Now, Aichi Asabuki stayed in Japan. Hiraoka left. And so as Americans, I'm an American, we know more about Hiraoka to a certain extent. Here in the West, we might not know about Asabuki, but in Japan, Asabuki was the governing influence. He was the galvanizing factor. He became quite a pedagogue. And pretty much through like the 1960s, anybody who studied marimba in Japan or xylophone, but first was the xylophone, but then when it became that the marimba was the dominant instrument more than the xylophone, they all studied with Asabuki. I believe Keko Abe also studied with Asabuki. So he was pivotal. There were other xylophonists in the 1930s, Shigeo Shimizu, Sadeo Iway that recorded. I have their recordings in my collection. So that was like the genesis of it right there. And then in the 1940s, the marimba arrived in Japan in the form of this tour by two musicians who were married, Lawrence and Mildred LaCour, who had been members of Claire Musser's International Marimba Symphony Orchestra, which is the King George Marimbas of 1935. And these people were evangelicals, Christian evangelicals. So they wanted to go to Japan and do like a Christian evangelical tour, and they wanted to use marimba music because that's what they did. They played marimba as well as the vehicle for that. So they toured Japan many times, like in the late 1940s, early 1950s. That's how Keiko Abe saw her first marimba, was attending a concert by the LaCour Evangelical Crusade, I think they called it, which was a marimba trio with two beautiful King George 4-octave marimbas and a bass marimba. So then the marimba was in Japan. And once again, Japan is very good at manufacturing, very advanced culture, and they pay attention to influences like that. And then next thing you know, Yamaha and then the Japan Xylophone Association was formed. Asabuki was instrumental. It's kind of like PAS for the xylophone in Japan, something like that, which is still in existence today. So that's trying to condense it all, but that's a little chunk there of what went on.
Yeah, and I was looking at Akiko's dissertation. It sounds like maybe Keiko Abe just took one lesson with Asabuki. It's kind of hard to say. It says he didn't normally teach at home, but somehow Keiko Abe did take a lesson with him. I don't know if they continued beyond that, but at the very least, there was definitely contact. She was definitely very aware of his playing, I think it's safe to say.
And I bet you, but I don't mean to interrupt, but I bet you Rebecca Kite knows the answer to that.
Yeah. And I kind of was Googling and trying to find something, and I found an article called History of Marimba in Japan Before Keiko Abe by Maki Takafuchi. So I'm sure there's more to the story than I'm aware of. But well, Dave, thanks so much for your time. And we had one last question for you, and that you have produced a course on marimba and xylophone history for Norm Weinberg's VAP Media. Can you tell us about this course, both your sort of background of your preparation, which it sounds like has gone back to the 1970s, really, and also what students can expect out of this course?
Yeah, so this course, like you said, is online at vapmedia.com. And it's called Marimba and Xylophone History. Short and sweet, Marimba and Xylophone History. So Marimba and Xylophone History, and what it is, it's an online course. So you go to vapmedia.com and you enroll in that course for a small fee. And then I believe it works that you have access to the course material for maybe 6 weeks or so. And a lot of times college percussion departments, their teacher will enroll the entire class in it, and then you get a discounted rate, and they use it for class material. And what it is it's 6 hours long, and it's divided into 10 chapters. So it's all basically chronologically. So chapter 1 is the earliest, historical information, and it's a multimedia presentation. So it's not just me sitting here in front of a camera, droning on. I think, I guess the cat's out of the bag. I like to talk on and on. Now that we're into our Zoom, but it's not just me staring at a camera droning on for 6 hours. So it's multimedia. And what does that mean? So there are videos of old performances, there are recordings, there are photographs, there are sheet music. And so it's not my face on the screen most of the time. Most of the time it's the media that is the video content or the audio content that I narrate. So I narrate the material. And so it covers the xylophone and the marimba. It's historically, chronologically arranged into 10 chapters. And then you access it at vapmedia.com.
Well, David, one more question for you. Could you tell us about your personal collection, both of instruments? I'm assuming you have some historical instruments, and maybe a few highlights of your other materials.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily collect instruments per se. I play the marimba, and I collect the memorabilia, but I don't really have what you would consider an instrument collection. So, but I do have a couple Deegan Imperial 4-octave marimbas from the 1930s. And that's what I play. That's why I have them. So I play marimba, and I generally play melodic marimba, which means I play a 4-octave range with either some type of accompaniment or ensemble or combo, right? So I have a couple old Deegans for that reason. I also have a couple very rare 19th century xylophones. One is a German 4-row continental xylophone made by the Otto Seal Company, and then an even rarer instrument made in the 1870s to 1890s in America, which is a 2-row chromatic American so-called straw xylophone. So both of those instruments, the German one and the American one, date to the 19th century, and they're called straw xylophones because the wooden bars rest on belts of straw, believe it or not.
Ksenija was actually just asking us, like in our group chat a few days ago, has anyone seen a straw fiddle before? So there you go.
And then in my career when I was younger, I went through many vintage. I bought and sold many vintage marimbas and xylophones, and so at one point I owned a 5-octave artist special xylophone. I owned 2 or 3 4.5-octave leady xylorimbas or xylophone marimbas. I owned leady xylophones, other Deegan marimbas. So I went through a period when I was learning where I was trying vintage instruments because I liked the vintage rosewood at the time, and some of those instruments had brass resonators. So I have owned at times, many vintage instruments, but now I just own my Deegan marimbas and then the 2 antique xylophones, which are just so rare. Those might end up at Kutztown University at some point. We'll see about that. And then beyond the instruments. I have.
Do you play the 4-octave xylophone? Like, are you skilled in the different configuration?
I'm not skilled in it. I can play it because I have hands, but I'm not skilled in it. It's a different keyboard layout, and then the technique is kind of fun. It's like spoon-shaped wooden mallets, and you play it with your thumbs facing the ceiling. So it's kind of similar to a zither or a cymbalum thing. And so that instrument was probably made originally in the 19th century as an imitation of the cymbalum. So it's like similar technically with the stroking to a cymbalum, the hammering. And
then are those rosewood, or do you know what kind of wood they are?
That particular one is rosewood. Sometimes there were also maple. Both in Europe and in the United States, sometimes they were maple, sometimes they were rosewood. Those 2 instruments that I'm referring to are both rosewood.
Well, this is cool. We've referenced the cymbalum 2 episodes in a row now.
Okay.
Maybe we can make it 3.
But sorry, I think you were starting to tell us something about the non-instrument things in your collection.
Oh yeah, so in my home I have a library that's exclusively marimba xylophone history, and granted I've been collecting this stuff since the 1970s, so I have many thousands of 70 RPM records of the xylophone and marimba. I have many hundreds of cylinder recordings, and we mentioned this earlier in the discussion, cylinder recordings that came up. I didn't really explain it. So a cylinder phonograph record it's shaped like the cardboard tube on the inside of a roll of toilet paper, and then the grooves go around the outside of the tube. So when I say a cylinder phonograph record, it's something like that. And then so thousands of disc recordings, hundreds of cylinder recordings, and then I own antique wind-up phonographs to play them on. And then I also have sheet music, a lot of vintage sheet music of many publishers and eras and styles. And then I also have what I call source material. I have thousands of antique photographs, antique newspaper clippings, postcards with photographs, instrument catalogs from the Deegan and Leedy and many other companies, early Musser Company, many companies that manufactured instruments, magazine articles, original manuscripts, original letters, correspondence, and one thing I did when I was collecting this stuff, I still collect, but when I was networking, a lot of times families of deceased percussionists would give me their whole collection, so there's like written correspondence, there's private things, so and this is an entire room in my home that I call the library, and my wife has a sense of humor about it, and letting me have that room for the library.
I hesitated to ask.
It's pretty funny because at one time, not too long ago, within the last, a decade or so, the family of Salvi Gavicchio Salvi Gavicchio was a xylophonist and marimbist, and he was the first marimba teacher at a university in the United States at the New England Conservatory of Music. He began teaching marimba there in the 1930s, and he was Vic Firth's mallet teacher when Vic Firth was a student at the New England Conservatory. And that family knew me, and I have that material. And then and Salvi Gavicchio passed away in the 1990s. And then about 10 years ago, I got a call from his family saying, oh, you know, we're selling the home, my parents' home. And we found in the attic like a dozen marimbas and xylophones, and we don't know what to do with them. So they said, the home's already sold. We already have the papers assigned, and we have a junk man who's coming here literally in like 3 days. And anything that's not out of that house in 3 days is going to the junkyard. We have like a flat fee. So I'm like, oh, okay, well, I can't let those, you know, go to the junkyard. So I spent the next 3 days, like, there was literally like a dozen, like there was huge, like a 4.5 octave Deegan Imperial marimba, 4 octave Imperial marimba, 3.5 octave, all kinds of Deegan xylophones, Glocks, pits, like everything. Like, and so fortunately, my wife was at a family reunion at the time.
Oh no.
I had a deadline, and the reunion was in a different part of the country, so she was away for a few days.
I mean, I guess better for her to come home to rosewood smell than some other woman's perfume.
Well, being that I'm a wise married man, I took that as a deadline. Okay, she gets home on whatever it was. She gets home on Thursday. I better have this mess cleaned up by Thursday. I mean, I couldn't walk in my home, and unfortunately, the family of Salvi Gavicchio, before I got to the house, they didn't know how you unpack a xylophone or marimba. They thought you take the cord out of the bars to transport it. So they went to IKEA and got like a dozen huge plastic totes and just filled them up with loose rosewood bars. And it wasn't like this marimba went in this tote. No, it was just like,
oh my God.
Whoa.
Apple orchard. So I had like the Rubik's Cube, the rosewood Rubik's Cube from hell in my home. And the clock's ticking, because if my wife gets home, you couldn't walk. I mean, like every room was covered, the floor, the stairwell and the stair, the kitchen, the couches, like I had to like do a, you know, like a tiptoe to get through the living room. And I'm like, you know, I got this like puzzle from hell. I got 2 days and 18 hours to figure this shit out, right? So I'm like trying to piece together. I got like 4 Deegan 870 xylophones, but for some reason I have like 4 2/3 keyboards. It's like, you know, so and I don't want this stuff. Like I'm not gonna play these instruments. I have the instruments I want. I have no room for anything else. So then I'm making calls all day. Hey, you know, do you want this instrument? Do you want this instrument? I'll sell it cheap. I'll sell it cheap. I'll sell it. You know, you got me at the right time. You know, she comes home tomorrow. You know, so yeah. So stuff happens, right? So yeah.
That was hilarious. I
cried.
cried.
That might be the most amazing story we've ever had on the podcast.
I think so.
Yeah, and in the end, I don't think I slept. That was the funny thing. I don't think I slept. I literally was like pulling all-nighters night after night, trying to figure it out and piece them together and get one, you know, and then in the end, I did get rid of them all with the help of my sister, who there was 2 instruments I still couldn't get rid of after the end of 3 days. And I called my sister, hey, can I stick these in your basement, you know? And then eventually I found, you know, takers for those too. So
sounds like a very niche episode of Hoarders.
I'm reformed though. That's good.
Oh God, yeah, that was amazing. Okay, I'll definitely edit that in.
Thank you. That's a great story.
Oh God. It's going to take me a while to recover from that one. Well, thank you so much, David, for your generous time today. It's been wonderful looking back at percussion history, and we will see everyone on episode 316.